of America, a Palestinian colleague as well, well versed on the issue of Palestine, Islamophobia, and other related issues to Muslims in the West. Today, we want to focus particularly on the UAE-Israeli deal that is now expanding, which has included Bahrain. There's talk of potentially Sudan joining in, and maybe Saudi Arabia as well. This deal is significant because up until very recent time, it was assumed, and particularly in reference to the Arab state, that any negotiations between Israel and Palestine will not be superseded or interfered by any Arab nations. And therefore, what appears to have happened with this normalization process is the sidelining of the Palestinians themselves and potentially disenfranchising them from negotiating with Israel with Arab backing towards them. To discuss this and many other issues for the next half an hour to 45 minutes, I have Dr. Hatim Bazian. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Hatim, and welcome to the show.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you, Ismail, for having me, and it's a pleasure to be with you. The distance does not disconnect us, but now it's connecting us in more ways than not.
Jazakallah khair for joining us. I can see you've got a lovely daytime back in America. We're in the evening. So between the time differences, let's hope we can try and fill the gap of the political gap of what is happening. So to start us off, Dr. Hatim, maybe you can give us a background of the significance of the UAE-Israel deal and how it's being read politically.
For anyone that looks at the history of negotiations, or at least the attempted negotiations between Israel, Palestinians, and the Arab world, Israel has always pursued the effort to bypass multilateral negotiations and pursue unilateral or bilateral, both unilateral steps and bilateral negotiations. And the first success of that strategy was signing the Camp David Agreement that removed a major piece of solidarity with the Palestinians away from the broader position of the Arab world, at least in the public as well as in the strategy. For those who remember, the Camp David Agreement was followed immediately by Israel launching an attack on Lebanon and pursuing an attempt to decapitate the Palestinian political leadership in Lebanon in terms of the PLO. So in here, the bilateral negotiations was always Israel's effort to have an approach where it singularly will pursue the Palestinians to compel them to surrender. This was followed by the Oslo Agreement that also created the opening or the bridge for Jordan to sign an agreement with Israel that normalized relations between Israel and Jordan, thus taking another piece out from the relationship. I need to remind people that the Oslo Agreement made it possible for the Gulf Cooperation Council to be a co-participant in the multilateral negotiations to address various pieces. And the key piece of that was the attempt to settle or liquidate the right of return. And the multi-party committee that was set up included both Western countries and Arab countries, and the GCC was a major player, which opened the door for opening commercial offices of interest between Israel and GCC countries. And then on the back of this, what you had soft normalization that took place. Soft normalization in relations to athletic competitions, programs that were included in relations to tourism and entertainment, soft or investments, and so on. So there's been a pattern of normalization existing, or at least being pursued from the early 90s, culminating in what we are seeing here in relations to the United Arab Emirates normalization with Israel. So I would like to situate it almost a 30-year plus process, or actually much more, beginning with Camp David, arriving to this, that Israel now is having these bilateral agreements that all are struck at the expense of the Palestinians, and Israel totally bypassing the Palestinians and removing the line of solidarity that existed from the Arab world, even if it was public diplomacy, while privately they were meeting the Israelis in Geneva, New York, and other places, but at least that public stand of solidarity was very important, at least to create that the Palestinians should be at the center of the discussions and debate vis-a-vis Israel and its relations in the region.
Thank you for that opening, Dr. Hatim. Now, before we proceed onto the Palestinian scene, what are the benefits to UAE and Bahrain? What political, diplomatic, economic mileage are they getting out of this?
Well, I do look at the region, especially the GCC, dating back to the Iranian Revolution, 1979, and the emergence of a change in the region away from the support for the monarchies and the structure that was there post Second World War and into the post-colonial era. The states post 1979 revolution went through a process of transformation, and this is again the GCC itself, the Gulf Cooperation Council, was created specifically as an anti-Iran security infrastructure, and at the time supporting Iraq's war against Iran in the Iran-Iraq war, in a way to contain the possibility of Iran's Islamic revolution and influence into the Gulf region. From that point on, there was also a transformation in terms of the working population or the workforce in the Gulf. It actually de-Arabized and also de-Islamicized the work population. And so all of a sudden, post-79, at least in the early 80s, there was actually a deliberate policy of sending back Arab workers from Egypt, from Palestine, from Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Sudan, and to replace it with specifically non-Arab as well as non-Muslim, because they were seen as to have a close cultural, ethnic, religious affinity to the Gulf population. So that was a strategy that also was pursued as a way to try to create in their mind, and those who are advising them, again from the United States, and I would say Israel possibly also was in the background, of how to provide security for the GCC countries. So all of a sudden, you actually have a transformation in the workforce in the Gulf, which accelerated also post the Iraq invasion of Kuwait, meaning that a push further toward this dynamics. Both in terms of United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, they were sold, and it was not a very difficult sell, that their security is connected, both one to the United States guaranteeing their security, but more importantly, that in the balance of power regionally, that Israel is their strategic ally in a possible confrontation or a possible threat from Iran. So they were sold that the primary threat on the region is not from Israel, but the primary threat is from Iran. And in this, that the only country in there, at least that's what they were sold on, the only country that is able to confront and balance the power, the rising power of Iran, is Israel. So you had a whole systematic process of actually developing these relations that culminated in the normalization, the recognition of United Arab Emirates of Israel, Bahrain. Oman is already having a de facto normalization because they received Netanyahu just before the death of Sultan Qaboos. Before his death, he welcomed Netanyahu, and just 2 days ago, we got the news that MBS of Saudi Arabia have met with Netanyahu even though that there's an attempt to say it did not happen. I tend to believe that it is happening, and Pompeo being in the region, definitely there is something being cooked, and I know that what is being cooked is not halal, but nevertheless is being consumed.
You can see the international dynamics, but what about the street level of these countries? What about the people on the ground? Are they now going to be oppressed by the regime, or do you feel there's a change in dynamics within the Arab street, wherein they feel that maybe Palestine is a foreign issue and it has got nothing to do with them? Or is there going to be some sort of antagonism between the people and the leadership of the respective countries?
Well, we need to at least to assess that in many of these countries, information is highly controlled, and political freedoms, freedom of speech, academic freedom is almost non-existent. If it exists on a superficial way. So there are definitely, I would say, within the street, you'll have people that are still having solidarity with the Palestinians, but you're dealing with a structure and a system of total control of their population. And then the projecting of the voices, media voices, the articulation of the message coming from the top leadership of the countries are basically projecting and increasingly problematizing the Palestinians, because in order to give support to that which really under any type of normal decency would not be supported, you need to actually demonize the Palestinians. And what we have is a structure of demonization. Increasingly, you're having individuals saying that Palestinians sold their land and sold their country. Palestinians have constantly failed to come into peace, essentially reflecting Abba Iban's statement that constantly is put in circulation, that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. So you have what you call these parroting messages that I would say most likely they're consulting AIPAC and Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs to try to actually use these messages to problematize the Palestinians, then pointing to the Palestinian authority and leadership corruption, something I agree with their critique, but the critique is being used in essence as a way to demonize the Palestinians and to remove any possibility of solidarity. So you have numbers of these individuals that are increasingly being put on the airwaves in such a way to say what the United Arab Emirates and some other countries in the Gulf are essentially pursuing their interests. Lastly, they're using also what I call Islamic Zionism or Muslim Zionist projection. And it says, وَإِن جَنَحُوا السِّلْمِ فَاجْنَحْ لَهُ. If they lean toward peace, then lean toward it. Completely misusing Quranic text, completely misusing the Hilf al-Hudaybiyah as a way to speak about it, or Hilf al-Fudul, that we want peace with everyone. Well, yes, everybody wants peace, but somebody slapping you and say, I want peace, that's not peace. Or you're in the grave and a knife in your back, and then saying you are the huggable Muslim. So there's this also using religious text, which is not unique, again, for those who study colonial legacy, colonial history, they understand the utilization of religious text as a way to try to give support to both colonization at the time, but also to that which really is beyond the pale in relations to religious ethics and religious understandings.
That brings us back very nicely to what's now within the Palestinian domain. What with the PA, we've also seen that the Palestinian Authority now have almost normalized relationship with Israel in the sense of cooperating, security cooperation has been reinstated, shall we say. How do we see the plight of the Palestinians themselves now? Or how do you see the future unfolding, not just vis-a-vis the UAE deal, but on the wider picture as well?
One has to recognize when we speak about the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian Authority right now, for all intensive purposes, is an employee, employees of both Israel and facilitate the protection of Israeli interests and occupation and settlement. So the period of thinking that the Palestinian Authority is pursuing any type of legitimate self-determination, independence for the Palestinians. That idea has to be dispensed with long time ago. So Oslo has provided for us is creating a ruling class selected and appointed by the occupation, the Israeli occupation, to control the Palestinian population that revolted against the structure, both in relations to the first intifada as well as the second intifada, wanting to end Israel control and domination. So, and you could see that you cannot be funded and supported by the occupying power to implement their security infrastructure. So the security coordination cooperation is only one issue or one problem of a larger problematic structure that was imposed. Remind people again, I wrote again on the Oslo Agreement and the security agreements that were put. Palestinians were given the responsibility to protect their occupier under both Oslo Agreement, Cairo 1, Cairo 2, wherever agreement, and you take it through. Essentially, we have accepted by the Palestinian Authority, not myself, to actually protect the settlements, protect Israel's right, without actually engaging or having any sovereignty whatsoever. In this sense, Israel, post the first intifada, opted to actually come back into classical colonization, rather than from 1967 to the 1987 uprising. Israel wanted to have its unique brand of colonization. It wanted to be in every neighborhood. It wanted to be in every street, having full reports from every corner. That became untenable as a result of the Palestinian uprising. So it resorted back to classical colonization, where you actually entice, recruit, engage a particular segment of the colonized population elite to implement your security. You give them the trappings of what you call prominence and importance. You give them their own courts to deal with native, what you call issues. You give them possibly a stamp where you put some of their native heroes or perceived heroes on these stamps, a phone exchange that you control, all the trappings in a sense, but at the end of the day, they are under total control. Those who followed the South Africa model would understand the same type was implemented in the black homelands that South Africa created. And for those who also engaged in the anti-apartheid struggle, understood the difference between Nelson Mandela on the one hand and Chief Buthelezi on the other, who was intimately implementing South Africa's apartheid policies and regime and was celebrated for it. So I think the Palestinian Authority, in essence, is structurally functioning in the same way of the apartheid structure of Chief Buthelezi governing over the homelands. And the security and control and monitoring is subject to Israel, United States, and in particular also Jordan was providing the technical know-how and the training. I have been calling for the Palestinians to completely ditch the Palestinian Authority, that it's about time for us to actually call for a government in exile and begin to actually operate with a government in exile, reconstituting a parliament in exile, and to continue to assert our demands for self-determination, for justice and freedom, and not to be an employees of a rent-a-cop to secure the settlements, settlers, bypass roads, and implement Israel's security at the expense of our population. So that's where we are in relation to the Palestinian Authority.
In relation to annexation itself and the rights of the Palestinians, or how they will be now, that obviously it's very difficult to foresee how Israel, whether will annex it or use colonial tactics and still get PA to control the population. Or could it also be that Israel could be emboldened and actually expel the Palestinians from the territory, the annexed territory in particular? And that would create a completely new dynamic.
Yeah, well, again, a longer history is important, a longer view. Israel annexed certain parts of the 67, immediately after the 67 war. It moved to annex parts of Jerusalem. It annexed parts of the Golan Heights in there. And then the travesty of the Oslo Agreement is that it's almost created a de facto process of annexation by delineating Area A, Area B, and Area C. So if we think about how Israel's move toward, one, expanding settlements, but also doing or undertaking silent ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, Area C was subject to a systematic process of strangling Palestinians' economy, agriculture, livelihood, to such a way to empty Area C of its Palestinian population. And Area C has really a large portion of the West Bank that is subject right now to Israel push for annexation. So what we have in Area C is already a de facto annexation of Israel that has been really in the process from before Oslo, but really consolidated during the Oslo process, and to such an extent that the United States, through the so-called Kushner's peace plan, and this is an insult to the term peace and plan simultaneously, but set that aside, it actually gave a nod, a recognition to Israel annexation effort, both in the Golan Heights, which it is an illegal annexation, as well as the Jordan Valley. Now we're speaking about, in terms of the following steps, is make Palestinian economy in a such desperate situation that you also pressure people to leave. And we have been experiencing what you call the silent ethnic cleansing that is taking place, because Palestinian economic well-being is being really hampered by ongoing Israeli policy. And also the consolidation that the only way for you to eat is to eat either from Israel's hands or the Palestinian authorities' hands, in such a way that independent economic activities on Palestine is to be curtailed, thus forcing the Palestinians to surrender because of their ability to have just their basic livelihood and having a meal on the table. So there is this push to try to squash and completely dominate the Palestinians in order to achieve a total surrender and bring forth the whole notion of Greater Israel. So the evangelical right in the United States accepting the annexation, also rapidly facilitating the emergence of Greater Israel because of theological reasons, is being met with the acquiescence of Palestinian leadership and the emboldened steps both of Israel political elite in relation to Netanyahu on the right wing. So that's the dynamics that we are witnessing today in relations to the Palestinian circumstances inside occupied Palestine.
Coming back to the UAE deal, in particularly in reference to Masjid Al Aqsa, there's quite concern the language that has been used there, and it's almost misleading for an average person that what the deal is actually saying, that it's going to open up access to Masjid Al Aqsa for all people. And the definition of Masjid Al Aqsa for Israelis is the not the Haram al-Sharif itself, but the Black Dome Masjid, whereas the Al Aqsa Haram al-Sharif itself now becomes available to everybody. You know, elaborate on that?
Well, I think one is we need to make sure to assert that it is not the business of United Arab Emirates or any of its functionaries, religious or otherwise, to make a determination or to assert any type of status relative to Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. This property, this area, which includes all of the plateau, that includes both Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, this is a Palestinian property belonging to Palestinians and continuously so. So it is not the business of United Arab Emirates to declare whether it has a free access or not free access. My assumption is that this statement was written to them by the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs And I wouldn't even go that it was translated for them in Arabic. It just was given to them in the English language, and maybe they had looked at it or not. They did not, I don't think, and this is giving them credit, that they don't understand what they were actually saying when they said it is to have access to everyone. This is what you call Israel seeking an affirmation of an Arab country to a whole process that has been in the making since the 1967 colonization and occupation of Jerusalem, to try to change the status relative to Al Aqsa Mosque and Al Aqsa Mosque territory up on the top of the plateau. By saying this, for those who follow the dynamics in Jerusalem, there's been a systematic process to try to get the settlers, the Zionist movement, as well as various parts of the Israeli extreme religious rights, to have a footprint and a post inside the Al-Aqsa compound. And now we are going through the same type of dynamics that we have experienced in Al Ibrahimi Mosque in Al Khalil, that now have culminated to Israel basically becoming the effective total controller of the rights and access and operations of Ibrahimi Mosque. The process in Al-Aqsa have went in order. First is to linear time access. As for anyone who visits now Al-Aqsa Mosque, know that there is time limitation that has been imposed by Israel in relations to Muslim access to their religious site. This is a process where outside of these times, then we could see the steps coming forth where on a daily basis, these Israeli right wings, those who want to rebuild the third temple supposedly on that property, are giving access under the protection of the military. There have also been plans and discussions by the Israeli government of building supposedly a tourist station on the compound. And the tourist station is specifically to what you call, in Arabic we say Musmar Juha. It is the nail of Juha that is to be placed in there. And now you have what you call a claim of a control over a property on the Al-Aqsa compound that is not subject to the Palestinian Awqaf or their right and determination, but subject to the Israeli military and Israeli government as such. So that's been a point of tension in there. So whenever we see these, it's an attempt to regulate time, then create a regulation of space. So when the United Arab Emirates signed to say that it's open for all, in essence is giving nod to Israeli policy relative to the rise to Al-Aqsa Mosque, which in essence is something that has been going on even during the negotiations. If you remember, for those who remember Clinton last negotiations and Camp David, where he came with the idea that whatever is above the ground will be Palestinian, what is underground will be for the Israelis, in order to come up with an agreement in relations to Jerusalem. But the question is that if that collapses, who owns the land? Now, understanding that Israel have tunneled all the way underneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque, crisscrossing with tunnels and creating all types of facilities underneath Al-Aqsa Mosque. So that's what I would say, that it's the height of irresponsibility of United Arab Emirates to put this framing of access to all on such a piece. And I think this came directly from Israeli interest in relation to Al-Aqsa Mosque, and to clothe it in any type of, that this is a type of religious dialogue and understanding, gives again mockery to the idea of religious understanding, dialogue, and interfaith. Again, in here, interfaith is masquerading in a wearing colonial garb and masquerading as a form of religious understanding, which is far from it. In this sense, interfaith is being empowered and emboldened in relations to the Palestinians. And I think what we need is to be very clear of what is being undertaken in there is to remove Palestinian sovereignty over Al-Aqsa Mosque and allowing the settlers, the Israeli right wing, the religious right wing, supported by the evangelical right here in the United States, to rebuild and to have a foothold on Al Aqsa compound, which is seen as a stepping stone or a precondition for the second coming. So we have to think how theology is actually being implemented in foreign policy, and foreign policy being rolled into this whole notions of discourse around interfaith and religious understandings.
Of course, I mean, while we appreciate that Palestine's sovereignty has been overridden, shall we say, by the UAE deal, short-ridden, shall we say, but also throughout the Muslim world. I mean, the Muslim world has great affinity to Masjid Al Aqsa as the first Qibla, the site of Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj. And therefore, I think the Muslim world itself are being undermined by UAE. And do you see a potential move or some resonance around the globe against UAE and Saudi Arabia? Do you think Saudi Arabia are more concerned about external Muslims than their own indigenous population?
Yeah, I do think that it's a major concern for the Muslim world, but I am worried that the reality of the Muslim world today is in a very precarious position. And I say this not to downplay the affinity and the strength and the deep roots of solidarity with the Palestinians, but at the political level, the Muslim world is almost in a state of disarray and chaos, with few exceptions. If you think about the number of countries that either have normalized or having de facto normalization, that's a major concern. The economic penetration of Israeli both tech and security infrastructure in various parts of the Muslim world is also raises a concern in this sense. Israel's relationship with China on the one hand and India on the other hand also is creating a concern for some of the Muslim countries of how to maneuver their particular type of dynamics. And I'm speaking about Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia in this case. And then simultaneously, you're still dealing with conflicts in Libya, in Yemen, that is seeing a massive destruction that the United Arab Emirates is involved in, that Israel is also involved in relative to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. And also the situation in Sudan is very precarious, Somalia. And I could add also the pressure being mounted on Turkey and Tunisia as a result of their political transformation. So one assessment of the political creates almost a paralysis among the larger Muslim communities around the globe to mount a sustained pressure to say that Al-Aqsa Mosque and Jerusalem is a red line. I'm still hopeful that we will be able to do so. And I do think that the role of Muslims in the West can play an important role. Not to say we are exceptional. So I am definitely not a person that exceptionalizes just because we have close, what you call contact with whiteness, all of a sudden we become exceptional. But I do think we have certain leverages and certain access and ability to project our voices that we should be able to translate this influence, this possibility of mobilization, where maybe in some Muslim countries right now, that possibility is not there. So I do think that we have to talk about how to rally the Muslim body at a global level in order to mount such a pressure, both on the United Arab Emirates, on Saudi Arabia, and also in Israel. So I think that's where we need to figure out how to do this in the next at least few months, if not the few years ahead of us.
I mean, a array of resistance have been put up by Imran Khan of Pakistan, according to the reports we're having, that Saudi Arabia itself is pressurizing Pakistan, or Imran Khan in particular, to normalize relationship with Israel. But there's something very telling here, that while Saudi Arabia itself hasn't normalized it formally, it's pressurizing other states. That shows surely a weakness in those Arab leaders, that they don't want to stick out their necks before others, and they need protection for this. So they understand that the global, whether call it Muslims or should we say the civil rights movement itself within the global society is against what is happening on the ground.
Yeah. Well, I think on the question of Pakistan, I think Imran Khan's statement in relations to Jerusalem and Palestine was very important and significant. That he said that this is for him is a moral, ethical issue that is not a matter of just could be a statecraft or just moving the steps. And also he resisted Saudi Arabia because if you remember when the Yemen war started, Saudi Arabia wanted to recruit Pakistan into the war effort. And Imran Khan came and met with the time MBS and was able to actually to maneuver out of the box that MBS tried to put him in there between Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, and also get some financial support for Pakistan at the time, which I thought was very, really significant political diplomatic maneuvering that he did. So Pakistan is an important state. Again, it's the only nuclear power in there in relations to the Muslim world, and its entanglement in the Yemen war would have been disaster. So I think in here Pakistan was very important in escaping that trap. But as you know, there's been a constant effort to try to normalize or try to push Pakistan to normalize relations with Israel. During the previous administration, I think it's during the Prime Minister Musharraf period, there was an informal process or informal delegations from Pakistan that went to Israel, and also meetings in New York on the sidelines of the UN annual meetings in November to try to see whether Pakistan could be pushed in that direction. But I think that whole process failed. So I do think that Pakistan is still one of the targets of both Saudi Arabia as well as Israel for normalization. In such a way, it's still one of the largest Muslim states. But more importantly, as you know, in the Gulf, there's a large number of Pakistani foreign workers that the hub of the administrative and technical know-how for Gulf countries comes predominantly from Pakistan as well as from Indian Muslims who have been really at the hub of building and transforming the Gulf for the past 50 to 60 years. So there is, in essence, if you think about on the larger political narrative, the push toward normalization of Pakistan is an important segment, which points to the weakness of MBS in relations to normalization. I think there is already a de facto normalization. Whether it actually moves to de jure and there is a full normalization, it depends on the type of resistance, both domestically in Saudi Arabia as well as in the Muslim world. And I think that we still can push toward resisting that element from moving forward.
We haven't got much time, but I think we can try and squeeze in one or two questions.
Sure.
One very important aspect is the idea that especially the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia in particular, now they're trying to undermine this or trying to protect their deal with Israel. They're trying to undermine any other narrative against them. And they're trying to criminalize Muslim Brotherhood, so-called political Islam. Now, them doing it within the Middle East is also being transported, in particular in Europe, with what we've seen in France and Austria, and maybe it could be adopted in Britain and maybe America as well. How do you see that transfer of legitimizing oppression or criminalizing Muslim activism?
I do think that both the United Arab Emirates in particular and Saudi Arabia, they have already internalized and accepted the Islamophobic narrative, out of their own self-interest in this sense. And it's not surprising that Daniel Pipes is a frequent visitor to United Arab Emirates, and supposedly he is providing workshops and training on how to deal with Islamists, which is the same type of narrative that we see that was active in the United States post 9/11, that is being right now subcontracted So again, I would say Israel and its operatives in the Islamophobia industry that we see in the United States, or you see with the English Defense League and the operatives in the UK, or Marie Le Pen in France, are being subcontracted right now to having a Muslim face on it. So in this sense, using a form of native expert in order to push for the same type of demonization, same type of targeting of Muslims. And we know that a few years back, the United Arab Emirates put out a list of terrorist organizations, which included almost all of our nonprofit organizations, all of the charitable organizations in Europe and the United States, in such a way to demonize them. More importantly, if you notice that both voices from the United Arab Emirates as well as from Egypt calling on European governments to crack down on mosques, to control and dominate the mosques. So it's not surprising that Macron's attempt to try to target Muslim institutions in France, as well as the whole project of prevent or counter violent extremism, has internalized and almost incorporated the same type of Islamophobic tropes that have been used by the Islamophobia into the discourses of Muslim countries, in particular United Arab Emirates. So their designation of the Muslim Brotherhood movement as a terrorist organization, I do think they're attempting, because a few days back Saudi Arabia's issued a fatwa on it, and then yesterday the United Arab Emirates issued a fatwa, and I would expect Bahrain to do similar. I do think this is in conversation with Israel, conversation with Sisi, who have cracked down very, what you call almost in a very authoritative way the past since the election of Biden, targeting all of the human rights infrastructure or activists in the country. So I do think these are steps that are coordinated and choreographed to try to almost tie the hands of Biden on the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, the engagement with the Muslim or Islamic organizations in such a way that United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Sisi, Israel, and the Islamophobic industry will actually mount a new effort to delegitimize any of the steps that might be taken. Again, this is not a praise of Biden, but in essence, this is a defensive step to preempt any type of changes in U.S. policy vis-a-vis the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and other countries. I do know that at least on the issue of the war on Yemen and sellings of weapons to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates and Egypt, I do think that the Biden administration will have a different direction in this, which might also curtail or at least limit their abilities to continue the war effort in Yemen. So that's how I at least read the current step that is being undertaken by the United Arab Emirates. It's at least in a complete choreographed, coordinated strategy between the Islamophobes, Israel, and the despotic regimes that are benefiting from this step.
Now for the final question, and you've come across very well, and you've put your case that the UAE-Israel deal does undermine the Palestinian. Israel is becoming more aggressive. The plight of the Palestinians is in question. Also, Masjid Al Aqsa itself is in potentially danger with right-wing extremist theological aspects entering into it. How do you think, putting all those things together, we in the West in particular, because most of our audiences today are from the West, should respond to that? What is your advice or guidance for them?
One, I do think that we need to continue to do organizing and to do the work that is needed. So I'm a strong advocate, if not one of the advocates of the PDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanction. And it's not surprising there is an attempt to criminalize the PDS movement. So one, I would make sure that individuals that are concerned about Palestine and concerned about Al-Aqsa, that you need to embrace the PDS movement. and make sure that you connect to your local campaign that is picking and having a particular type of mobilization. And I know for the Muslim community, we're always building up for the Ramadan period, where we have the date boycott campaign that has been part and parcel of our strategy. So I encourage for those who are listening to do that. I know there's other campaigns by different organizations. So pick the organization that you work with and the campaign that you could be most effective. Just want to make sure that the PDS campaign has to be understood. So I'm against sending 1,000 companies list and to say to individuals, boycott this. This becomes what you call a counterproductive strategy. So again, our focus on particular campaigns and particular strategies to effect change. Second, I do think that we have to continue to push for Palestine in every aspect of civil society. I always say that silence does not change history. So silence on this question, because people are demonizing you or people are unreceptive and so on, the effort by our opposition is to demonize and silence you, because with silence there is no political change. So I want you to be more assertive, to actually speak out, to write, to create all your form of new media. And I know that today our media is very accessible. So be creative and engage in all elements of civil society and don't take no for an answer. So that's a very important step in there. Third, which is very important, in places where we are able to run for offices and for election at all levels, whether from school board to library association to museum, I want you as a person that works on the Palestine solidarity movement, or also work to confront Islamophobia in its various, I want you to actually get yourself up and run for these seats. The worst thing that could happen is you could lose. That's the worst thing. But again, you have to lose many times, possibly, before you win. And part of running is you put your agenda forward and you put your ideas forward. Today, we're only complaining about others running and others putting their ideas. When you run and you engage in the political landscape, you actually put your ideas. And running does not mean that you are co-partner in the wrong. You need to assert your own ideas of what is it that you want to make change in. So I encourage individuals to actually run and partake in these political competition, civil society. At least you know you're paying taxes. So if you're paying taxes, but you're refusing to take responsibility for those taxes and how to spend is very important. Lastly, I do ask individuals to contribute financially to the institutions and the organizations that are doing the work. We're never going to meet and have the same type of resources that the Zionist organizations have, or the monarchies that have almost a water tap of resources that they send. But don't underestimate the quality of good, sincere, charitable work that is going for a purpose. So I want to encourage you to make sure that you dedicate a portion of your resources to support the organizations that are mounting a resistance to Palestine in whichever way possible. And I encourage you to do so, because otherwise you're assuming that people can move a mountain without actually giving them a shovel to move that mountain. So what I would ask you is to give enough resources to actually use that shovel, or to buy the shovel, or to empower people that are using the shovel to do so. So those are elements that I think are very critical for us to push forward. The lastly, which was not an item, is also to be what you call cognizant of all the efforts internally toward what you call, I'm very critical of the whole interfaith space that is actually faith washing, to be very clear and critical that just because somebody wants to hug you and wants you to become a huggable Muslim does not mean that you want that hug. So I want to make sure that we actually are very clear that people need to engage with us on our principles, our priorities, and our ethics and morals, not because somebody likes us. I really, liking me or not liking is not really a pursuit, but rather to have a principled ethical engagement and put our issues forward. If somebody disagrees with them, at least that's their problem, not mine, because I at least put my ideas forward.
Dr. Hatim, Jazakallah khairan for your expertise, your knowledge, your commitment. Allah extend your shadow upon us and guide you to strength, inshallah. To our viewers, inshallah, if you want to assist us or follow FOA and particularly BDS campaigns that we run, visit our website or follow us on our Twitter at Friends of Al Aqsa and join in on the various campaigns of political lobbying, campaigning, letter writing, monitoring the media, demonstrations and other events that we hold. So inshallah, until next time, Dr. Hatim and all listeners, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, see you soon again.
Wa alaikum assalam, jazakumullah khair, and may Allah bless you, give you good health, and keep you in good spirit for everyone and all your family and friends, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.